Hey everyone, this is Sanjeev from KodeKloud, and today we are going to take a look at a service called Amazon S3. So this is a service provided by AWS, and it's an object-based storage service. So what does that mean? It's really just a service that allows you to upload and manage files. And what type of files would that be? Well, that can range from a couple of different things. So this could be media files for your application, so things like audio, image, video files. It can store code. It can store artifacts generated by your CI/CD pipeline. It can really store any type of file. The important thing to consider is that it is object-based storage and not block-based storage. And so we're going to dive into what is S3, how do we work with it, and then we'll do a nice quick demo going over how to manage your files in S3, how to set up a bucket, and some of the different features when it comes to versioning and encryption and things like that. So let's get started. So what exactly is S3? S3 stands for Simple Storage Service. So there's three S's, that's why it's called S3. And S3 is a object storage service provided by AWS that provides industry-leading scalability, data availability, security, and performance. And so that's kind of the marketing term for it, but what exactly does that mean? Well, it's basically a place for you to store your files. So you could kind of think of it like Dropbox, right? You upload your files and Dropbox stores it safely, and then you can retrieve those files whenever you find convenient. And so it is an object-based storage, so it's going to be excellent for storing things like log files, various media files, so things like audio, video, and image files. You could store your source code in there, and really anything else. So any type of files that you could store it in S3. Now in S3, there's this concept of buckets. And so files in S3 are grouped together in a bucket. And what that means is that a bucket is kind of like a folder to store all of your files. And you can have more than one bucket in your AWS account, and you can have really as many buckets as you want, and you can kind of group things however you'd like. So if you wanted to, you could create a separate bucket to store all of the files for App 1 and a separate bucket for all of your other applications that you might be hosting on AWS. If you wanted to break it down so that maybe your source code is in one bucket and then your media is in another bucket, or if you wanted to make it so that one team in your organization gets one bucket and another team, you can absolutely do that. But buckets are really just a way to kind of group files together. Even though buckets act as folders, within a bucket, you can actually break it down into different subdirectories. So you can have as many different subdirectories as you want, and then those subdirectories can then store the files. And the files that you store in your bucket, each file is going to be referred to as an object. And so that's why it's called a object-based storage. And so with S3 objects, let's take a look at what an object is actually made of. What are the different properties associated with it? So an object is going to contain three things, three pieces of information. First, it's going to be a key. So the key just represents the file name. So what is the name of the file? The value is going to be the actual file data. And then finally, if you have versioning enabled for S3, which S3 does support versioning for your files, you're going to also have a version ID that each different version is associated with. In addition, S3 supports a max file or object size of 5 terabytes, and you can upload unlimited amounts of files to S3. So that's one of the great things about S3. It just scales right up. You can just keep uploading as many files as you want. The only limitation really is that the file can't be larger than 5 terabytes. When you create an S3 bucket, you're going to have to give it a name, and the name has to be unique globally across all AWS accounts. And so what that means is, let's say one user for a certain account creates a bucket called KodeKloud. Well, when a S3 bucket gets created, they'll actually designate and reserve a URL for you so that you can access the files within that bucket. So if I reserve, KodeKloud as the name of my bucket, this is going to be the URL that's going to be associated with this bucket. And so since these are our URLs, they're going to have to be unique across all accounts. So if somebody else on a separate account tried to create a bucket named KodeKloud, it's not going to work. So each bucket name has to be unique across every user on AWS. So once we actually create a bucket, how do we access the files within the bucket? How do we add new files to the bucket? Well, there's three different ways to do that. The first one is to use the URL. So this is going to be the format of the URL for your bucket. So it's going to be https:// then it's going to be the bucket name .s3 and then whatever region this bucket is associated with, and then it's going to be Amazon AWS.com/ and then whatever the key of the file that you're interested in. So you could send whatever HTTP methods to kind of manipulate the files in your bucket. So that's the first method. The second one is you can always use the console. So you can go in, you can upload files, you can download files. And then lastly, we could do it programmatically through code. So you can use the S3 SDK to manipulate files, add new files, new folders, and things like that. Now, as mentioned, S3 does provide data protection. So what S3 will do is it'll actually replicate your objects or files on multiple devices across a availability zone, which is just a data center. So you're going to see it replicated across multiple servers. In addition to that, it's actually going to get replicated across multiple availability zones as well. So you can actually handle losing an entire data center or an entire data center going down, and your files will still be intact and you'll still be able to access them. So that's the data protection that AWS provides with S3. Now, S3 offers a range of different storage classes that are going to provide us a varying level of data access resiliency with different levels of cost based off of, how resilient do you want the data, how quickly do you want to be able to retrieve the data. So just to kind of go over the different storage classes, the first one is S3 Standard. So this is probably the one that's most frequently used. This is offers high availability and durability for frequently accessed data with low latency. So this is great for obviously anytime you need to get files very quickly, you're going to want to use S3 Standard. It has a very high durability. That's 11 nines, I believe, which is spread across multiple availability zones. The overall availability is 99.99% over a given year. And the great part is, since it's spread across multiple availability zones, with S3 Standard, you can sustain an entire data center going down and still be able to access your files. The next storage class is S3 Intelligent Tiering. So, trying to figure out what is the most optimal storage class can be a little difficult. There's a lot of calculations, a lot of monitoring of, your data access patterns. And so if you don't know what is the best storage class that's going to be for your application or your business, you may want to use the intelligent tiering, which will actually analyze how your data is being used and accessed, and will actually move you into the storage class that is the most optimal and cost effective for the way you retrieve your data. So if you don't know what you want to do or you don't know which storage class to do, it's best to probably select intelligent tiering so that AWS can figure it out intelligently for you. The next one is S3 Standard Infrequently Accessed. So this is for data that doesn't have to be accessed frequently. And because it doesn't have to be accessed frequently, the overall fee is going to be less than standard S3. However, if you do retrieve this data, which doesn't have to be, they're going to charge a retrieval fee. It's going to have the same latency and throughput as S3 Standard, and it has a 99.9% availability. Then you have S3 One Zone Infrequently Accessed. So this is the same thing as S3 Standard IA, but it doesn't require data to be replicated across multiple availability zones. So if you don't need that extra durability of having it across multiple availability zones, then this is going to be a cheaper option because it's only spread across one data center. Then we move on to the Glacier storage classes. So anytime you see Glacier, this is for, very, very infrequently accessed data, so like archive data. And so you have S3 Glacier Instant Retrieval, which is going to be the low-cost storage option for archive data that's rarely accessed. However, since it's instant retrieval, it still allows you to retrieve the data within milliseconds, and it's going to have the same performance as S3 Standard. The next storage class is S3 Glacier Flexible Retrieval. So this is once again still part of the Glacier storage class. So this is once again meant for archive data. But for the flexible retrieval, this is going to be for data that may not need to be immediately accessed, and it gives you a flexibility on how you retrieve the data or how quickly you might want to retrieve the data. So this is going to be 10% lower cost than your traditional S3 Glacier instant retrieval, and it can be retrieved at different speeds. So you have the expedited retrieval. So this is if you need to get it quickly. You also have standard retrieval, and then you have bulk retrieval. So those are the different options. And then finally, we have S3 Glacier Deep Archive. So this is going to be the cheapest storage class, and this is meant for long-term storage retention that doesn't need to be retrieved quickly. So the retrieval time can take up to 12 hours. So this is really, if you have got some sort of like regulation where you have to store data and keep it for like 7 to 10 years, you would want to just dump it on there so that you have the lowest cost, because most likely you'll never need to access it. But if you do, usually you're not in a rush and you can just get it within, 12 hours or so. So I think that's enough of an overview regarding S3. And so now let's go ahead and log into the AWS console, and we'll take a look at how we can configure a bucket, how we can upload and retrieve files from our S3 bucket. All right, so to get started creating our S3 bucket, let's go to the search bar right here, and I'm going to search for the S3 service, and I will select that. And I want you to notice one thing before we actually create our bucket. Take a look at what is the region. So right now it just says global. So when you actually access the S3 page, it's kind of like a global service. However, when you create the bucket, it's actually going to be at a specific region. So this is something to keep in mind. But here you could select create bucket here, or we can go to the side, select buckets. This is going to show all of our buckets. I have none at the moment, so I'm going to select create bucket. And then here we're going to give our bucket a name. I'm going to just say test. And then here you can see we're going to provide a region. So even though it's global up here, we still have to specify the region where the bucket's going to exist. So I'm going to leave it as US East 1 as the default for me. And then I'm going to select create bucket. And when we do that, it looks like it errors out. And it says bucket with the same name already exists. And like I mentioned, buckets have to be globally unique. So some other user someplace else created a bucket named test, he owns that name. So I have to create something that's unique across all AWS accounts. So I'm going to say this is going to be KodeKloud-test. And then now we can take a look at the other settings. And so here there's a couple of settings for object ownership. So here, this is just going to disable ACLs. This is kind of the recommended approach. When you enable ACLs, this allows you to kind of put in rules as to, other AWS users or other AWS accounts can now access your S3 bucket. Whereas when ACL is disabled, only your account can access the bucket by default. So we're going to just leave it as disabled for now. This is the recommended approach. And then here, this is the public access setting. So how should people be able to access your bucket? And so right now, you can see we're blocking all public access. So no public users can access our bucket, and we're going to leave it like that for now. And then we go down here, we have versioning. So if you want to enable versioning so you can keep track of previous versions of some of your files, you could do that. So I'm going to go ahead and enable versioning. If you want to add in any optional tags to your bucket, you can do that. Then down here, we have the encryption. So if you want to encrypt your files, you can either use the S3 managed keys, which is S3 or AWS managing your keys, or you could select the second one, key managed service, where you're kind of managing the keys yourself. And so I will just leave that as enabled by default, and then I will select create bucket. All right, so now that our bucket is created, let's go ahead and select it. And so right now we're in our bucket. We have no files, nothing, and we can now upload files to our bucket. And you could just drag and drop. So I've got a couple of files here. These are just a couple of pictures of some dogs and some cats. I'm just going to grab all of these and I'm just going to drag it here. And so it's going to upload all of these files. You can see the destination is the S3 bucket called KodeKloud-test. Here you can update any permissions if you wanted to, or any specific properties. You can also specify which storage class you want these files to be associated with. So by default, it's always going to be the standard class, but you could change any one of them. And so the storage class gets defined when you upload the file. So, which class do you want to use for these files? I'm going to leave it as standard for now. Then we've got some encryption settings, some tags and other optional stuff, but I'll go ahead and select upload. And so now it's going to go ahead and upload those 4 files. We can see all 4 have succeeded, so I will close this out. And we've got our 4 files. So I've got cat1, cat2, dog1, dog2. And I'm going to select one of these files. And here it's going to give us some information. So here's the S3 URI. We've got the ARN for this resource. And if you want to download the file, if you're on another computer or at some point you want to retrieve the file, you could just select download. And it's going to just download it just like that. And so we've got that file downloaded onto our local machine. If you want to take a look at this in the browser real quick, you could select this open button, and it's going to use your account credentials to actually take a look at the file. So this is our file. And down here, this is our object URL. So this is kind of like our public URL that anyone can access to access our files. If we select this, it's going to throw an error. And I'll zoom in just so you can see the error. And it says access denied. So why does it say access denied? Well, if you remember the permission settings, we selected deny all public access. So if we go back to our bucket and go back to KodeKloud-test and we go to permissions, you could see that we selected block all public access. So that's why it's showing that at the moment. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to select edit here and I'm going to uncheck this box. So we are basically allowing everything right now. So you can, granularly define, what you want to allow to have access to each of your files. Right now, I'm just kind of setting everything up to be public. And so if I hit Save Changes, we're going to have to then confirm the changes. And now if I go back to our objects, and I'll select our cat object, I'm going to now click on this URL. So this is, when you click on this URL, it's a little different than clicking on here, because if you click here, first of all, you could see that it's got our security token embedded in this. So that's why you can access this. When you select this is like a random user on the internet accessing your file. So let's try this out now, since we've made it public. And we can see that we get access denied again. So why did it get access denied? Well, let's go back. And we'll go back to the bucket, and we'll go to permissions. And if we take a look at the permissions overview, it says access as objects can be public. So that's a little bit weird, because we did, turn everything off when it comes to all of the permissions and the access lists and things like that. So you would think it would be public, but if we just hover over this, it says the bucket is not public, but anyone with the appropriate permissions can grant public access to the objects. So to actually make the files truly public, what we have to do is we have to configure a policy. So we have to define who's allowed to access what. So what we're going to do is we're going to edit our policy to make it so that we can access any files in this bucket. And I'm going to paste this policy in, and you can see this in the example documentation, and I'll add a link in the description, of course, so that you guys can take a look at how to actually customize your own policy so that you can only make sure that certain files that you want public are public and nothing else. So just to quickly go over the policy here, we're just defining the version. So this is just going to be the default here. And then here under statement, there's going to be a couple things. So here effect is going to be allow. So we're going to allow somebody to do certain things. Principal means anybody. And then the action is we want to be able to perform a get operation. So we want to be able to get an object from S3. That's what we're doing when we go to that URL. And then we provide the resource that we want to apply this permission to. So for the resource, it's just going to be our bucket. So here you provide the full ARN for our bucket, and then I do the slash and then the star. So this is saying any files, which is what that star is. It's saying any files in this bucket should now be allowed to be retrieved by anybody. And so I'm going to save this policy. And so this policy is now in place. And I'm going to go back to objects. And I'm going to go to cat1 now. And I'm going to select the URL. And you can see we can now see the file and retrieve it from anywhere, really. And so that's what that policy did. It's just saying that anybody can access our files now. And let's just double check to make sure all of our other files can do the same thing. So let's go to dog1. And I'm going to open the URL. And you can see we can access the puppies now. Now, as I mentioned in the slides, we can actually create subfolders in our bucket. And so if I go to create folder, this is what's going to allow me to create a folder. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create two folders. I'm going to create one for dogs. And then I'm going to create one for cats. And so what I'm going to do is I want to move all of the cat images to the cat folder and all the dog images to the dog folder. So I'm going to select the cats, and then I'm going to select actions, and then move. And then here we want to select the path to our bucket and then the specific prefix. So this is going to be KodeKloud-test/cats. Or you could just like browse S3, and this will allow you to kind of go through the GUI. I want the cats folder, and it's going to automatically fill in the destination. And I'm going to select move. And once that's done, I will close this out, and I'm going to do the same thing for the dogs. And I'll do the browse S3 again. I'll select the dogs folder. And then I will move those. So now if we go back to our root folder in our bucket, so we're in our root, and just to make sure I'm going to go back and I'm going to select this, and we can see we've got two folders, no other files. And if we go into our cats folder, we've got our two cat files. And if I go back and go to our dogs folder, we've got the two files here. Now that's great. But let's say we want to change something. Let's say that we want users to be able to access the dog folder and access all of the images within the dog folder, but we want to make sure that the images for the cats are private. How do we do that? Well, we can go back to our bucket and we go to permissions and we go to our policy and we want to edit our policy because as I mentioned before, this asterisk here is going to represent all files. So we're saying that you should be able to get all files in our bucket. But instead, if we only want to make it so that the dogs folder is public, we could say dogs / and so now everything in the dogs folder is public and all other folders are private. So now if I save the changes and we go back to our objects, if we go to our dogs folder and we grab one of the dog images and I get the URL, we can see we can access it. So far that's working. And then if we go back to our bucket and then now go to cats and grab one of the cat images, and if we select this, you can see access denied. So that's how you give public access to certain folders and not other folders. All right, so the next thing I want to show you guys is versioning. And so I'm going to go back to my root directory. And I have this file here called test.txt, and it's just a file that says, hello everyone, this is day 1. And I'm going to upload this file to our bucket. So I'm going to select upload. And I'm going to just drag it in there. And I'm going to select upload. And after it's uploaded, this is going to be our first version of the file. Now, if I go into the file again, and this time I say I change this to day 2, and I save this, and I then upload the same file, same name, I'm going to upload. Let's take a look at what happens. So if we go to our folder, we see there's only one file. And that's because, we named it the same thing, so the key is going to be the same. But what is actually happening from a versioning perspective? Well, if we select to show versions, and we'll ignore the cats and the dogs for now, we can see that there's 2 files here. There's tests.txt, and then there's another test. So the parent one is going to be the current version, and this is going to be the previous version. So if I select the current version, which should be the latest one that we uploaded, and we open this up, you can see that this says, if you can read that, this is day 2. So this is the second version. And if we go back and we go to the show versions and we go to the previous revision, which is nested underneath here, we can then open this up and it should say version 1. So that's how the versioning system works. And in addition to storing the previous revisions, if I go back to KodeKloud test, the bucket, and then I select test.txt and I select delete, I'm going to delete this file. And as I mentioned before, when you have versioning enabled, when you delete it, you're not truly deleting it. It's still going to keep the file. What it's doing is it's just not showing you the file. So if I select show versions, down here under test.txt, notice how there's still some files associated with test.txt. And what it's done is it's added a delete marker. So this is just basically telling the UI, don't actually show the files to the user. We're still keeping it for versioning purposes, but we're not going to show it to you. So you've still got the files saved there just in case you ever need to bring them back after accidentally deleting them. And if you want to bring them back, all you have to do is select the delete marker, and then you want to delete the delete marker. And so I'll say permanently delete. And after that's finished, we should see that we now have the files showing up again. And if I remove the show versions, we've got the test.txt file. So let's now take a look at the final thing I want to show you guys, which is the lifecycle rules. So if we go under management and select create lifecycle rule, what this is going to do is this is going to allow us to move files from one storage class to another based off of some policy or criteria. So I'm going to give it some name. I'm just going to call this default rule. And then here we could specify the scope of the rule. So, which objects in your bucket should this rule apply to? So if you select the first one, limit scope of this rule to using one or more filters, you can provide a prefix. So if you just wanted to go to, like /dogs folder, so only have the objects within the dogs folder be have these rules apply to that folder, you can do that. Or if you just want to apply it to all objects in this bucket, you can just select apply to all objects. And then you have to make sure you select I acknowledge that I'm going to do this to all objects. And then you have a couple of different options. So if you select move current version of objects between storage classes, what this is going to do is this allows us to move objects that are in our bucket to a different storage class after they've been in our bucket for a certain number of days. So by default, we go to this standard S3 class, but let's say after 30 days, we want to move it to standard infrequently accessed data because most likely we don't need to use it. So after 30 days, it's going to get moved to that class. And what's cool is you can keep adding these transitions. So after, let's say, 90 days, we can move it to Glacier Deep Archive because we'll most likely not need it anymore. And this is just a checkbox saying that we're going to get a one-time cost at that point. And so that's how you define these rules. You can put as many rules as you want. Now we have a couple of other things that we can modify. So move non-current version objects between storage classes. So what is this non-current version object? That just means previous versions. So if you've got versioning enabled, then what should you do with the previous or old versions? So you could select that. That's going to open up a new options box here. And you could say that, let's say after 10 days, you want to move to one zone infrequently accessed, and then you select the number of revisions that you want. And once again, you can also keep adding in rules to move them into different storage classes as you go. And just going over a couple of the other options. So permanently delete non-current versions of the objects. So if you want to delete old versions after a certain amount of time, you can do that. So this is where you apply all of these rules, and it's incredibly flexible. AWS has given us a lot of functionality out of the box to be able to, automatically kind of archive old files and move them around so that we're not paying the premium price for files that we're probably not even touching very often, or if at all. Okay, so now we've kind of covered all the features I wanted to cover for this video. Let's go ahead and delete our bucket. So I'm going to go to buckets, and I'm going to select our bucket here, and I'm going to select delete. And when we try to delete it, it throws an error. It says this bucket is not empty. So there's files in it. So it's saying we have to empty the bucket before we actually delete it. So let's go back here. I'm going to select our bucket again. I'm going to select empty it. This is going to delete all of the contents of our bucket. I'm going to say permanently delete. So this is just deleting the contents of the bucket. So now our bucket is empty. And so once it's empty, we can then go and delete it. And now we've successfully deleted our bucket. So if we go back to buckets, we can see that there's no more buckets left. All right, guys, so I think that's going to wrap up this video. We got a chance to learn about AWS's object-based storage service called S3. We got a chance to go over some of the various and more common features, so things like versioning, security. When it comes to encrypting the files, we got a chance to demo, uploading and downloading the files from S3. There's still a ton of more features to dive into, so things like replicating across different regions, as well as hosting a web application off of S3. But I think that's everything I wanted to cover today. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the video, and I will see you guys in the next one.